So to start with this big concept of just sustainability transitions, it's of course a very contested combination of many contested concepts, and there has been a lot of discussion about it in academia, in practice, in policy, in activism. We build on a lot of different schools, and we broadly define just sustainability transitions as processes of transformative change that enable quality of life of present and future generations for all humans and other living beings, and enable them not only to survive, but also to thrive and flourish. And obviously, unfortunately, a lot of beings thrive and survive at the cost of each other. So this means that even though this sounds like very fluffy and hallelujah, in reality, this is a stage for fierce and very deeply political power struggles. So when we want to understand just sustainability transitions in the context of cities, it means that we look at cities from these three perspectives. First of all, acknowledging the different power relations and inequalities that are there, and also trying to understand how these are changing. We are particularly interested in understanding how people try to transform their cities through innovation, and not only technological innovation, but also social innovation. And last but not least, the topic for today, how people are empowered to transform cities through these translocal networks and connections. So this is where this word of translocal comes in, which, to very simply put, is basically about the connections between different localities. So it can be the connections between different cities, but it can also be between different districts, different neighborhoods, different streets, different regions, different continents. So it's really about acknowledging localities at all scales and of all sorts. So it can also be about urban-rural linkages, and so on. So this is also really the reason to call it translocal rather than transnational, to kind of challenge this idea of national borders as being the starting point for everything. So just to give you an example of some of the translocal networks we have looked at in the past, this is one of the research projects we did in the past, where we looked at 20 translocal networks, from the Impact Hub of social entrepreneurs to La Via Campesina, which is a global movement of farmers, to the Basic Income Network. And we studied these translocal networks, but we also looked at how they kind of manifest at local, regional, and national level. And we did this across 27 countries in Europe and Latin America. These are just 20 examples. There are thousands more of these examples. And we were very fascinated to learn more about them. And one of the things we did in that project was to bring together representatives of these movements and invite them to come together and discuss what are some of their commonalities, because there is huge differences across these networks, but there is also some commonalities. And one of the things that came out is this notion of translocal empowerment. So that we see that a lot of these networks are very locally embedded. If you look at a Transition Towns initiative or something, it's like hyper local. It can even be at the level of the street. But at the same time, they're also globally connected. And we found that it's particularly this connection between the fact that it's both local and global that makes these networks so empowering, because on the one hand, people have a tangible, direct result of what they're working on in their direct environment, while at the same time also being connected and having a sense of wider impact. So I'll skip this for the sake of time. And one of the things that was argued in this manifesto is the need to have more intersectional solidarity and collaboration across these different networks and movements. And translocal empowerment plays a very important role therein, where we really have this hope that these translocal networks can kind of really challenge this false dichotomy between global and local. That it can really integrate the best of both. So connecting communities internationally and promoting global solidarity, while also really acknowledging and reappreciating deep local identities and traditions. And we hope that this can help to respond to current political debates on globalization, immigration, and nationalism. And we think that a lot of these translocal networks are not really visible and don't really play a role in these kind of ongoing public debates. So we really hope to get more attention for that. So this is me emphasizing, celebrating all the delights of translocal networks. Of course, there's lots of challenges, which I could talk about for another half hour, about power relations and inequalities. I'm not going to do that because today we invited our speakers to share their experiences with both the delights and the struggles and challenges. But before we do that, before I introduce our first speaker, we wanted to get a little bit of a taste from you, our participants. These were the 3 questions that we posed to our speakers, and we were actually curious to hear from you, our participants. What do you think? So the invitation is for you to also get used to the chat, being vocal in the chat. It's a chat storm after all. The first question is, what translocal networks are you part of? And then maybe just use words, popcorn style. This is not gonna be an official publication, so just popcorn style. What do you think are the main delights, and what do you think are the main challenges? So to kick it off, question number 1. What translocal networks are you part of, or would you like to be? What do you think are some of the delights of translocal networks? One word. Great. Okay. And then the final question. And again, feel free, if you're not fast enough, feel free to edit later, no problem. What do you think are the main struggles? I think we're getting already quite some impressions here. So we're done, we can go home. No. Thanks a lot for sharing that with us, and feel free to keep sharing as we move on, which is what we're gonna do right now. So we're very excited to announce our first, what we called keynote practitioner, co-founder and co-director from Cooperation Jackson, one of the finalists in the Transformative Cities Award. And we're very happy that he could join us today, Kali Lakano. So I'm gonna finally stop sharing my screen and hand over the word to you, Kali. Thanks for being with us. Kali Akuno, sorry.
All right. Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning again, wherever you're at. I'm calling you from Jackson, Mississippi, where it's a bright but unusually cold, I guess it's the spring, with the changing of the seasons due to climate change. It's kind of hard to figure out where exactly we are a lot of times these days. And I'll start with that in part because kind of as to why we are doing some of the work that we're doing, particularly with the ecological focus that we're doing. This month, we've had a record, what's been longer than a month. We've had a record 7 out of the last 8 weeks, tornadoes and severe storms here in Mississippi. And we are now, I guess, officially a part of what's called the United States Tornado Alley, right? Which was traditionally a little further to our west, right? Mainly in the Great Plains kind of region. Well, that has definitely kind of occurred here in almost every Wednesday, Tuesday or Wednesday of the last several weeks, a month and a half. We've had some form of tornado. This is not new. It's not traditionally normal, but it is becoming part of the new reality that we have to confront, and why we are putting these issues kind of front and center within our agenda. Now, they exist in a context, and we talk about both the joys and the struggles of translocal work. I'll start with one of the struggles that we have. When we started, we developed what we call the Jackson transition plan, right? Just transition plan, which outlined how over the course of a 10-year period, we were going to work to make Jackson a zero waste and a zero emission city. And we had the support of the administration at that time to kind of make on these things, make them happen. What we've immediately run into, however, and this is becoming a global problem, was the growing strength of the political right, particularly on the state level here in Mississippi, where in 2017, the Republican Party, which is in essence really a neo-conservative, neo-fascist organization, in truth attained a supermajority in the state of Mississippi. And one of the first things that they did was go after our little ragtag organization and a few others like it that were advocating for just transitions and sustainability, regenerative economies, etc. They made it basically illegal for any municipality to come up with its own zero waste, zero emissions, or just transition plans. And that anything of that nature, or anything ascribing to it, adhering to anything, either from a federal kind of a mandate, or more specifically, anything having to do with the United Nations and its program, would have to be approved on a state level, meaning effectively it would never happen given the current constitution, demographics, and political breakdown. So how do you get around those type of limitations, right? Just because they say no doesn't mean that it has to be no in reality. Like, that is our organizing orientation. And we pretty much adopted a framework that we're going to implement all that we can implement and then ask for permission later, right? So we're working towards all of the sustainability, all of the integration, and building local networks to the greatest extent possible. In fact, we've accelerated that on our end, just seeing where things are headed politically on a national level with the United States, and then just on a local and a statewide level. So one of the things that we've done, and I'll speak about briefly, is find what we call kind of our close sister organizations. These are organizations, a few organizations that we share political alignment and then practical integrated work with it, not so much that we're doing it together as of yet, but following along the same course. And that same course is folks who are doing some form of land decommodification, right? And land back issues, decolonization work, and then doing cooperative development and other forms of solidarity economy, institutional development. And that network we was founded in the midst of the pandemic. One of kind of two general things that we founded in the midst of the pandemic. This was in 2020, and it's called the People's Network for Land and Liberation. And it consists of ourselves, Dishkama Humboldt, which is the Wiyot tribe, and allied organizations which are working together with this towards decolonization and building a solidarity economy up in the Humboldt region of California. It entails Survivors Village down in New Orleans, which we're directly connected with, community movement builders in Atlanta, Georgia, and Detroit, Michigan, and then the Center for Grassroots Organizing and Cooperation Vermont, up in Vermont. And what we are essentially trying to do is build our own integrated network of shared practice, shared curriculum development to try to help the movements in a number of critical ways, and get other folks to adopt some of the things that we've adopted. And we've been trying to be as transparent as possible about what has worked for us in each of our locales and what doesn't work, or like these are some experiments to not do that we have done, so you can avoid yourself the pain of trying to do some of these things given a certain context, or at least learn from them. And what the stage where we're at now, which is what I'm most enthusiastic about, is joint planning with each other, particularly around agriculture development, to be able to both feed our local communities more within a food sovereignty framework and connection, but also to do some direct exchange through our locales, right? And the aim here is for us to build our own supply chains and value chains. And we've all heard about how those have been struggling all over the world. But what we're really trying to do It's called regenerative networks, like regenerative supply chains. And that is all of us learning, what plants, what foods, what herbs actually grow within our bioregions and try to emphasize those. So it's a form of relocalizing in many respects, right? But also getting into a habit and a practice of rebuilding the natural ecosystems in our environment over a long-term process. This is something we think will be essential towards, cooling the world, stopping climate change, but also altering eating practices, eating habits to make them much more sustainable in the future, and us creating the kind of the trade networks to be able to do that level of exchange, which gets us beyond the limitations of the current kind of capitalist-oriented production process and transportation process. So we are very hopeful for these things, and these are things that we want to see other networks throughout the globe really pick up. And we'll be doing a lot more over the summer and in the near future to kind of share our experiences and best practices and what we've learned in the course of this last 2 years and where we think we're headed and what the benefits will be. So really looking forward to that, and want to encourage everybody, wherever you are, to do the same to meet the challenges ahead, which are going to be many. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kali. I wrote down some things. If they say no, does it mean no? No. That was a great quote. I'm going to remember that one. Thank you very much. A lot of recognizable, but also very, also some new elements. Very inspiring. Thank you. We'll come back to you. So people, if you have any question to Kali, please note it down, and later on you can share it in the chat. So please start thinking of questions that you would like to share with Kali. In the meantime, we move on to Sol Trombovila, which is a perfect transition because, no pun intended, as I mentioned, Cooperation Jackson was one of the finalists in the Transformative Cities Award, which was led by Sol Trombovila, or is being led by Sol Trombovila, who is a project officer at the Transnational Institute and the coordinator of the Transformative Cities Award. And we're very happy to have you with us. Sol, over to you.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to all the organizers to explore this notion. I will be very quick in my 5 minutes, so apologies if I speak a bit too quick. Hopefully there are time for questions. So let me just say I'm working for 10 years in the Transnational Institute, a think tank based in Amsterdam. And I have been part of translocal solidarity networks for more than 10 years. And that helps me to understand some of the struggles and some of the weaknesses that these translocal activities have. And let me just share that my first big experience with that was against the privatization policies in the European Union after the financial crisis. So all the struggle against the Troika, doing massive mobilization against the European Central Bank in Frankfurt and others, and also being involved in different networks working against the power of transnational corporations. And a very first delight that this kind of translocal activism has is that even if you are a very small group of activists in a particular city or a location, you are able to become global. So we really had a lot of experimentation on how to go for global actions days against international institutions or transnational corporations. And by being part of that, you could make an action, let's say in Amsterdam with 50 people, but suddenly your rather small action becomes global because there are similar actions happening in maybe 50 or 100 cities elsewhere. And if you are able to really frame your communication wisely, you can really become a global movement or a global network that really has a say on how global issues are governed or not. And through that experience, we got inspired by a number of things at TNI, and we found that it was very relevant to study what was happening at the local level in terms of resistance to privatization processes, and then also new forms of political activity like new municipalism with the takeover of local institutions in many countries, especially in Europe, but also in Latin America and other places. So we decided to look at those phenomena to understand which processes were transformative and which processes were happening at the city level. And the reason for that, very quickly, is that we believe capitalism as a system is outdated. And this means that it's rumbling. And there are different ways it could go. It could go for a multi-stakeholderism model. I can go way deeper on that, but let's say corporations will rule at the same level than the states. We will go to a model based on authoritarian nationalism, which is the Trumps, the Le Pens, and others, or we could actually go to a post-capitalist world. And a post-capitalist world is a very difficult thing to achieve, and it has been trying for hundreds of years with different schools of thought and practice. But we can really see that there is a tipping point to actually create the opportunity of this systemic crisis to achieve that process of transformation. And for that, this brings us one of the weaknesses of translocal solidarity, which is that usually these translocal networks are composed by pretty local, well, by the name, no? Local groups that often is very hard to understand when they're actually capable of systemic change. And for that, we think this is like looking at a sky in a very dark night with many stars, and you can see news there, or somebody shares you an article, or you actually meet people doing amazing work, and you have many bright stars, but you don't know which ones are actually really transformative. So it's a local cooperative producing their own food with renewable energy, able to beat the big transnational corporations. No, so when you look at and by looking at that sky, we see there are many frameworks that try to classify or to give sense to them, like frames like the commons, social solidarity economy, the right to the city, remunicipalization of public services, the buen vivir, and many others. And all of them have their own networks and analysis, and they are useful in their own right, of course. Our proposal to look at this sky at night is to look what's happening at the city level in the way that local groups are able to transform their demands into rights. Demands to access to basic services or goods like water, housing, food, and energy. So these are precisely the four categories of the award we started at the Transnational Institute to try to understand how these local processes of transformation were happening and which ones of those cases deserve more attention by everyone so they can obtain the resources and the capacity to network and to scale up or to expand horizontally in this moment of massive flows of information. So we created this award, and it has been an extremely interesting experience. I have been coordinating this for 5 years now, almost. And let me just conclude, or start concluding with this. This Transformative Cities Award is a process platform to facilitate the transition to a post-capitalist world. So this is what we are trying to achieve. And this platform is really a space for a very different set of groups, if you like. So of course, the most important ones are those doing the hard work of transforming the world, like Kale Akuno and all the friends from Cooperation Jackson, like in many other places. We provide a platform for them to have the opportunity to tell the story to the world. We also attract international evaluators to revise those cases and to help us to understand which process have not have the right to win, but deserve more attention. And this is how we create the finalists, that then we bring journalists to help these groups to tell the story. And then we have a popular vote. So we open the votes in this award to decide who are the ones who, even require more attention from our side. And let me just end to say that for this platform to work and for any other translocal network, I think what is important is that the outcomes of the network are clear. It can be a global day of action, it can be achieving a policy change or whatever, but this action outcome has to be very clear. The process has to be very clear, and this is what we try with an award. It has a cycle with a year, and this is the process and how to engage in the process. And and finally, to understand yeah, the potential of each one of the groups in the network, what they can provide. Some groups are very good at social media, for instance. Other groups are very good at research. Other are very good at local actions. And to identify that and accept that not all networks are capable of anything, it really helps us, the platform, to move forward. I leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sol. So the slogan of the Transformative Cities is, or it was, another world is not only possible, it's already happening, right? If I remember correctly. So it's also really about showing everything that's already going on. So very inspiring. Thanks a lot. So I invite everyone to also have a look at that Transformative Cities and Atlas of Utopias. But first, we're going to move on to our first chat storm. And for this, I'm going to share my screen to explain how this is going to work. So, chat storm part 1, what on earth is a chat storm? So basically, it's a way to try and democratize Q&A sessions, questions and answers, to try and involve the participants in deciding who gets to ask a question. And we're going to experiment with it now first, and then we come back to it after the next 3 speakers. So the way it's going to go is like this. Type your burning question on translocal solidarity in the chat once we ask you to. Well, if it's burning, it can also be simmering. Just share your question. And then, very important, mention if your question is directed at anyone in particular, for instance, Kali or Sol or anyone. And then we will pick the first question, for instance, by Dominique. Then we invite Dominique to unmute herself. Dominique reads out her question. And after she reads out her question, we invite Dominique to nominate the person who gets to ask the next question. So the idea is that you don't only read out your own question, but also pick one to be asked for the next time. And I'll walk you through it. So if you get confused right now, that's fine. We'll get through it. It's always a bit bumpy in the beginning, but usually we get into it after a while. So we take 2 questions at a time. Then we have our panelists answer. And then we move on like that. So maybe we have 2 or 3 rounds right now before moving on to the next speakers, or first have a mini break. But first, yeah, and the idea is to, this is really an open exchange, right? So we're not asking our panelists to, legitimize or provide the full answer to everything. It's really meant as an open exchange, not an academic discussion, but an open exchange. And also in the meantime, feel free to share any other resources. So if you don't have a question, but more want to share something, feel free to also add that in the chat. But for the chat discussion, we kindly invite you to really formulate questions. And then later on, feel free to share resources and inspiration. Like, for instance, the music list that we use for these events. We have a long list that was co-created by participants, which we will also share with you. So maybe you also have a song, that's also fine. Okay, so now is the time for everyone to think about their questions. So I'm going to give everyone 2 minutes to write down their questions.
What is the role of anti-racist work in translocal solidarity initiatives?
Well, as I mentioned in the chat, I think it's foundational to this work. It has to be foundational to this work. Dealing with these issues has always been at the heart of kind of the American experiment. Just given, how it was unjustly constructed, from stealing land and then importing people from the other side of the world to come work either as indentured servants or work, as enslaved people. Sometimes those 2 overlapped, actually. And I think, this is, in many respects, is not new to Europe either. It was just more or less often framed around ethnicity than it was per se around race. And we know that there's been profound issues of, ethnic discrimination and experiments of genocide within the European context. So both have their own particular dynamics, but the particular kind of racial dynamic, we know is becoming much more acute in the European context because of, the population shifts and dynamics, particularly the immigration, and it's picking up. And we need to be clear that that's going to do nothing but accelerate. And if a solid core anti-racist politics is not really built in the European context, right, on a trans, kind of national level, right, translocal and a transnational level, it's only going to further embolden the forces of the right and actually make them stronger, right? And we see major problems with that all over Europe, but a large part of what's actually may be decided in the next couple of days in France, right, and its global impact is hinged upon this particular politics, this particular orientation in many respects. So we have to develop programs to get more people to engage in the internal reflection that you're involved in, and then be able to willingly, openly share, be willing to make mistakes, like in the sharing, right? Because along that journey, if there's not different people who are actually feeling the brunt of racism, to kind of at different points in time say, hey, well, I challenge you on this, or I want to push you on that for you to grow. Sometimes people think, there's a dynamic that has long existed, say, like in the United States, where there are white liberals who kind of think they know best for Black people or Latinos, et cetera, without ever consulting or being in relationship with us in the dialogue, to be like, no, that's actually not what I need, or it's not what I need from you. I actually need something different. If there's no direct communication, no direct exchange, then even some of the best thinking ideas will fall flat or actually do more damage. So there's a way in which being an anti-racist means being involved in practical work with folks who are feeling the brunt of racism. That is a critical piece that I think we have to put in the mix, but it is essential towards moving this work further in the future, particularly so that we can combat how racism fuels the right and strengthens the right in all of our contexts.
Thank you, Kali. So Saul, the question was also directed at you, but there's also one other question to you, so maybe you can answer them together.
You mentioned systemic change and how difficult that is to achieve. What would be some major indicators that systemic change is actually happening? What are the things that can tell us that something important is going on?
Thanks for the questions. Yeah, let me say that this question of transformation is a question we're trying to solve, and we don't have a definite answer. And we're in this journey using the same parable on trying to understand that. And let me also say that without having a critical lens to the world, acknowledging the racist structures that are in place, it's impossible to understand the dynamics that are happening now or in the last centuries. So for us, it's a fundamental element to trying to understand how to transform the world to a better place, that many of the structures are based on racism and exploitation from one groups to others. And that leads to many practical challenges, such as in a world like transformative cities, in the first editions, we very quickly got many participants from Europe, for instance, from some parts of North America, but it was very hard to get groups from Africa, from Latin America, from Southeast Asia, because for them it's very difficult to find the time to film a form to explain what they are doing, no? So it's important to recognize the special attention you have to bring to those parts of the world that are suffering racism most structurally, and try to bring extra resources to those regions so they are able to also tell the story and to get the visibility they deserve. That's already a good step. And on what means, what is systemic transformation, for us, our lens is to try to understand how a demand becomes a right. And for us, this process is very, very important, because it's a different one that, for instance, all the theories around class struggle, for instance, which is important, and all the capacity of organizing a class against the other. This is an important frame and can explain some things, but for us it's interesting to like what they are doing in Jackson. I keep remembering one of the first times I met Kali, he told us in one of the neighborhoods of Jackson, the only way you could get food was to get to the 7-Eleven store. Imagine that, you know, this is the only place you can get food. That is really mind-blowing. And through that process of recognition of lack to access of healthy food, or they started to say, okay, we are going to grow our own food. And similar processes are happening elsewhere. No? So when this process happens, when there is a demand, we want food and we actually achieve it, regardless of what the power says, as Kali was explaining, then is when things get interesting. If it's only a demand, then it's not transformative enough. Now, there are very good plans in many places, but you really have to be able to show that you have achieved this right. The ultimate way to achieve that is when this becomes a law, and there's some thinking on that. No, so when you create laws that ensure, for instance, access to healthcare, like we have in Europe, many places still, and this is kind of the ultimate. But sometimes it's not even the case. No, we have seen cases in Bolivia with in theory progressive movement with Evo Morales, but local groups had to still find ways to ensure access to water, regardless of the state laws. So even when you have a national law, and we have many examples of constitutions that protect access to housing, but it doesn't really work. No? So for us, that's a very interesting process to understand how a demand becomes a right, regardless of who is, regardless of other frames. No? And when you look at this frame, there are many ways people self-organize to achieve these rights. No? And it can take forms of trade unions, of cooperatives, of mass mobilizations, etc. So that's more.
Thank you, Sol. So we move on to the next question.
Are translocal networks always empowering, or can they be the opposite? And if so, why? You mentioned the political Republican supermajority that is making your zero waste and zero emissions work hard. Do you also involve sympathetic political organizations in your translocal work?
I said I'll take a crack at both of them. Number one, we should not assume that like this kind of intellectual province just strictly belongs to the left. It doesn't. Like in our context, the right is actually far better at this than we are, and are gaining some significant ground here in the United States. I mean, I would encourage, if you're not, just look at what the right is doing this year alone in terms of passing local and statewide legislation against abortion rights, against LGBTQ rights, against environmental standards, banning books. You know, we're back at that stage here in the United States. And of course, you know, the books are about Black people, gay people, Latinos, you know, challenging subjects. And this is because their local networks are far better organized than ours, right? Controlling the school boards, controlling the county commissions, right? Controlling the municipalities, right? They're very good at that. And I'd imagine that just from a few things I've seen with elections in Europe, you know, the past couple of years, Austria, Germany, France in particular, some of the same lessons and techniques are actually being shared and applied both. And in fact, I know some of they are because they're building their own international forces, right, to share and exchange these linkages and pass on these lessons, right? And so we need to do the same. So yes, they can be disempowering, right, for select groups and target audiences, target populations. That's all was breaking down. We know that they can go in that direction. How to strengthen ours is a critical piece, you know, within our translocally, across regions, and then internationally is a piece that we have to figure out. I think those of us who want to see a just society, which includes everybody and not just privileges a few people, right? You know, primarily white, male, heterosexual folks. The second question, If you mean by political parties, yes. If you mean by just local organizations, definitely yes, right? Like we can't do what we do without partnerships in the community. It's not possible, right? And in the political organizations, you know, like we're involved in a very active but delicate dance here in Jackson. One like the vast majority of folks Black people in Mississippi are members of the Democratic Party. We have long-standing issues with the Democratic Party, however, and trying to build an alternative to it. But the way that the rules are kind of rigged in the United States in general, it really kind of only plays itself or lends itself to kind of this two-party monopoly, right? Like you can run other parties, but we don't have anything similar to what, you know, exists in most European countries, you know, where there's like actual fracturing of power and coalitions have to be built. That does not exist in our, since it's basically a winner take all system. So if you're not in power, you have to then, if you're not the party in power, political party in power, you then have to figure out maximum ways to exert social power, right? Where you don't have political power. And that is what we have kind of always concentrated on. That's not necessarily new. Like the political electoral arena was a secondary thing for us, and building the social networks and the social movement has always been the primary thing for us, because of this piece around trying to create a new political vehicle, which we want to do to really separate us from some of the bad policies that the Democrats themselves push, right? And to break this kind of monopoly that exists where we only can choose between Pepsi or Coke, which is really not an option, right? So that is a delicate dance that we are trying to do of you know, being in coalition with the kind of democratic forces in town and in the region, when and where we align, but also being very clear that we're going to push them, right, and try to create something to hold them accountable at the same time. So in short, we do, and we definitely, you know, don't think that you can do this type of work without engaging the political structures in many in political parties. But I think being keenly aware of not being dependent upon them and having a base of power and execution outside of them, so they can't dictate to you or to anyone like what can be done and how it will be done, you know, and by who rules and regulations.
Thank you, Kali. So now you get an idea of the chat storm. I remember when we were studying translocal networks many years ago, and this also had to do with the networks that we chose, of course. One of the critiques that many of them got is for being apolitical and not political enough. I think we've just seen two networks and two kind of pieces of work and two activists that really show the opposite, that these regenerative, prefigurative networks, as some call it, that really focus on creating something new, can also be very political. So that was also really something I took out of how political this work can also be. We have just started and we're warming up, but I think we also, because it's a 2-hour meeting, I think we need a mini break before we move on to our next 3 speakers. And please stay tuned if you also still have questions to Kali and Sol, because we can still come back to them in the next round of a chat storm discussion. After the break, we will have Sophia Silverton from ICLEI. We have Namita Kambli from the 3rd Generation Environmentalism, who will also talk about cosmopolitan justice. And we have Camilla Sons on the Translocal Lives project. So 3 really interesting translocal initiatives. So I just want to give you a very, very, very short refreshment break. Let's say 3 minutes. We start again at 5+5. So run to get your water, coffee, whatever you need. And then in 3 minutes, we start again. So welcome back. Ready for the second part. Looking forward. And our next speaker will be Sophia Silverton, who I had the pleasure of working with in the Urbana project, which he will also say a bit more about. And she now works as an officer of governance and social innovation at the ICLEI network. which she hopefully can also say a little bit more about. Thank you. Over to you, Sophia.
Thanks, Fleur. That was a good break also. I went and stuck my head outside of the window for some fresh air. Good. So hi, everyone. It's nice to be able to share some of my experiences in the good company of the other speakers. And as Flora said, I'm happy to be speaking today about the Urbana project, which stands for Urban Arenas for Sustainable and Just Cities. And then perhaps a little bit later in the chat storm can also answer questions about our work here at ICLEI, which is a network of local governments for sustainability. But since I only have 5 minutes, I chose to focus on this Urbana project, which is one in which we really tried to bring the topic of sustainable and just cities to the forefront by first reviewing hundreds of other EU-funded projects that touched on these topics, and then bringing these themes and these ideas that we found into very interactive spaces, called arenas, that we discussed and strengthened these ideas with the experiences of participants from all across Europe and from many different backgrounds as well. So it was quite a translocal project in the sense is that we were co-creating knowledge together with people from many different backgrounds. And one of the real delights of this process was that this project, I think, had really good design in the sense of sustaining this translocal network. So we had a series of fellows, which were 15 or so, a dozen individuals that we selected to follow the process along with us from various backgrounds, sectorally speaking, but also different countries. And then we also had a series of individuals within our wider community of practice. And this design really helped us have a consistent core of people who are really engaged on the topic all the way through. And it generated a sense of personal connection between the people within the network, which is something that popped up earlier in the chat when we said, what are one of the delights that you guys think are, you all think are part of Translocal Networks is this personal connection. And so the design of this project particularly, I think, helped to foster that, even in an online environment, which it was mostly, unfortunately. However, it wasn't all sunshine and daisies. I think there were some challenges with having a mostly online translocal network, which was very geographically spread out throughout Europe. Part of the purpose of this translocal nature was to capture and exchange knowledge from as many different voices and perspectives as possible. But I think that sometimes it's hard to go wide and deep at the same time. And so what this meant is that occasionally certain voices were missing from our conversations. And this often included the voices of people who are hurt the worst by unsustainable and unjust cities. For example, certain marginalized groups. And I think we can also suspect that there's a common group of people who are often more interested and able to take part in translocal networks, especially if they're more abstract and not really rooted locally, like ours was very much an online community with some local elements. So we're thinking academics, some policymakers, formal NGOs. And so a challenge for us is to really find ways to include people outside of these usual suspects. And we had a good few tries at this. For example, we said, hey, why don't we invite certain representatives of community groups that are really working locally with individuals who we would like to hear the voices of. So we did this, but I think it's something that we can continue to think about and gain as a lesson from the project. And yeah, and I think also it's just another challenge of working translocally is just making sure that you're on the same page as a group, whether this is through the language that you're using. We were using English, so in a sense, this already rules out a big group of people that can no longer participate. But then also whether we're using academic language together and so on. So this is something to really consider when we organize translocal activities. Who are we able to include, and can we find common ground to have discussions on? And so yeah, just to summarize the main lesson that I've pulled from the Urbana project, and what I'm also discovering to be important in my work at ICLEI, is that translocal networks need to be very well designed in order to generate connection, personal connection, solidarity, knowledge sharing, and especially inclusiveness, and that this doesn't necessarily happen automatically, organically. So we have to program it into our planning for our networks and consistently think about this. So I will end it there and look forward to the chat storm later.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Interesting to hear all those struggles we went through, but also the delights. Thank you. Okay.
You muted yourself, Flor.
Thank you, Sophia. I said lots of things, and but I'm not going to repeat everything I said. Thank you very much for your contribution. We're going to move on to the next speaker, who is Namita Kambli, urbanist and senior researcher at the Third Generation Environmentalism organization, maybe also a network, I think. And we met a few weeks ago during a very interesting event on justice and sustainability, where Namita passionately introduced the concept of cosmopolitan justice, and I was really intrigued to hear more. Over to you, Namita.
Thanks, Flo, and thanks for having me. It's been a really inspiring discussion so far. And just to say, E3G is actually a climate change think tank, but we do a lot of work with other networks and coalitions. So I guess we are part of a network, if not a network in itself. Before I talk about cosmopolitan justice and how it factors into my work on in European policymaking, I'd just like to set the scene and talk, by reflecting on the translocal network that E3G currently convenes in the form of the European Green Deal and Society Group. Now, this is a non-formal but diverse group of organizations working at the social climate nexus and covering a range of interests, including climate, social and racial justice, consumer rights, democracy, open governance, and local energy transitions, among others. Now, the last time that the group came together was in November to collectively navigate what was at the time, and continues to be so, a very negative rhetoric around the energy transition and energy prices. And the goal of this convening was to sort of refocus on the broader, more positive agenda, social agenda that the European Green Deal, which is the EU's growth strategy, so to speak, should enable. Now, this discussion was then written up. What we do essentially is that we write up some discussion in the form of a workshop summary, which we then share with representatives of Parliament and the Commission, including the Commission Vice President Timmermans, so as to make sure that this informs the highest level of decision making. Now, working with this group is by far one of the highlights of my job for several reasons, but some of the key ones being both collective intelligence and action. Now, as we know, climate change is not only a wicked, but a super wicked problem. Its causes are complex, its impacts are devastating and interrelated, and potential solutions to climate change or climate action might in fact trigger new vulnerabilities. Now, no one individual, organization, or government can solve this by themselves, which is why we need collaboration of efforts, data, and skills. And building on this, there is also a possibility of joint action, be it advocacy, joint events, policy briefings. But this is essentially an opportunity to both generate and disseminate knowledge into people's own individual networks and create a positive snowball effect of sorts. But what this also does, however, and this is a part that is hugely important to me, is that considering the despair narrative, and someone touched upon this in the chat as well, the despair narrative that is associated with climate change, part of my everyday job, is that working with this network gives me a reason to be hopeful when you see just how many people are committed to the cause of socially fair and inclusive climate action. And you know, several of those people, I mean, are on this call as well. I'm guessing everyone here is committed to this cause. And yeah, it definitely doesn't hurt that I've managed to gain some really wonderful friends along the way as well, people who are part of this network. And these varied relationships also help me cope with some of the struggles of building and working with translocal networks within the current policy framework and its limits. Now, often when our group gets together to put forward policy recommendations, there are questions of competencies that almost always surface. So I'll give you an example. Climate is a European competency. Social is a national competency, but most of the action happens on the ground. That is to say, it is local. It happens in place in cities, regions, and villages. However, the current architecture of policymaking does not allow for the sharing of power or voices at the scale that is required, which is definitely a barrier to achieving a just transition to climate neutrality. But just as importantly, the notion of climate justice, as it currently stands in policymaking, is very much limited to distributive justice, and by that I mean costs and benefits, with less attention being paid to procedural justice, which is about access to justice itself, and recognition justice, which is about who gets to have a say, who gets to be at the table. But a tenet of justice that we hardly ever sort of see or acknowledge in policymaking itself is what is called cosmopolitan justice, which is what I talked about when we met. Now, by now, it is well established that decarbonization should not create new injustices or exacerbate existing ones. However, like I said, the discourse in Europe continues to be centered on our own borders and is very much about protecting those within it. So against the current geopolitical context, when our interdependence on one another is more pronounced than at any other time, we simply cannot afford to disregard this tenet of cosmopolitan justice in the transition to clean energy. And there are several scholars who have actually studied this. So according to scholars such as Sovakul, for example, cosmopolitan justice dictates that human beings have equal worth regardless of their ethnicity, gender, or social status. So simply put, this is a form of solidarity and responsibility that we have towards one another, and that should go beyond borders. As a group, when it comes to policymaking, we acknowledge that the clean energy transition will have external costs, be they in the form of sourcing materials, generating waste elsewhere, or even extractive supply or value chains. But what we are currently confronted with is the lack of policy tools that do not factor in global climate justice as a part of impact assessment, or patchwork policy regulations where mainstreaming this concept is politically fraught and problematic and contested, like you said at the beginning. Now, because I am a glass half full type of person obsessed by the need to believe in a better or fairer world, I will leave you with this. Now, we find ourselves increasingly in a world where protectionism is on the rise, but what we desperately need is a global vision that is centered on the idea of cosmopolitan justice. My work has actually taught me that translocal networks hold the key to shaping this vision, but the question actually remains, how do we enable them? And I will probably leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Namita, for that wonderful introduction and explanation of cosmopolitan justice. I realize I'm asking a lot for speakers to talk for 10 minutes or even 5 minutes, and you're all doing an amazing job in conveying so much information. Thank you. Then we move on to our last speaker. And we're very happy to have her second. So Camilla Sons is a project researcher at the Translocal Lives project, which I think has also been funded by the Vital Cities and Citizens Initiative. And I look forward to hearing from you. And I think Camilla is going to share her own screen. Over to you, Camilla.
Yes, thank you. So, hi, everybody. Let me share my screen. I have some slides, especially because the project I want to talk about today is rather visual. So I think I can, let me know if you can see my screen. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Oh wait, sorry, because I think I forgot to share the audio, which is really important. There you go. You see my screen? Okay. So I think I'm going to take you along a different angle of translocal networks, and that is, how do we research actually translocal networks? This project, which is called Translocal Lives Research Project, We basically, in a nutshell, aim to understand the relationship between digital technologies, placemaking, and the settlement experiences of newcomers with a refugee background in the Netherlands, which obviously are people who are living translocally and building translocal networks in many aspects of their lives. So what we do there is that we try to understand how they develop different strategies to both connect with the host community, connect with other refugees, connect with jobs, learning the language, for example. So how do they develop these strategies to, let's say, build a sense of placemaking, but also how they keep in touch with, let's say, friends or family left behind, other initiatives somewhere else? How do they keep updated with news somewhere else? So how do they actually live translocally, and what are their perspectives or what are their challenges in doing that? So what you see actually here in the picture is the participants of this project. We had participants from around 5 countries: Syria, Eritrea, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. And we engaged with them for 2 months in a program which is called the Digital Placemakers program, for them to learn very basic tools to develop their own narratives and films around placemaking. So for us to research something as unique as translocal lives, that everybody lives in a completely different way, we wanted to have new tools beyond, for example, interviews or more conventional, let's say, research tools. So we developed this program. And what you see here, it's actually the 11 movies, the 11 posters, plus 1 poster of a documentary that we produced. These films are all produced as autonomously as possible by the participants, by the newcomers, and they all touch on how to live translocally in a country like the Netherlands in particular. And especially they focus on what are the challenges, how do they develop resilience, what motivates them, what opportunities do they find to, for example, meet new people, to support each other, and so on. I would love to talk about each of the movies, but of course we don't have time. So I'd rather show you 1 minute of a documentary so you can see a little bit how the workshops went, but also what was the relevance of engaging in a project like this for the participants. So please let me know if you can see this playing and if you can hear.
So I have to try it from camera? Yeah, you can tell me what time, not play it from the app. No, you can. Ik denk dat we iets doen dat jij alles wat zeg maar wat ik wil. Ja, dat is geen probleem.
Ik heb heel veel dingen in mijn hoofd, mening, opinion, maar ik kan niet goed uiten. Ik kon niet. Maar nu, ik vind een weg voor mijn mening uiten. Ik vind een goede instrument. Bedankt voor dat.
It was really great experiment for me. I enjoy it, and I think I have lots of motivation because when I came here, I lost all of my trust for myself. But this experiment gave me, this program gave me, I think, trust again.
I think it's a very...
And again, I would love to show you the whole thing, but of course we can't. You can find it in the link that was shared. There you can also watch the movies online. But just to share with you the key points on what is a great contribution of this project in terms of researching how to live translocally and how to build translocal lives, is the participatory approach to media making. So I'm sure that in all of the projects you've mentioned today, media, it's an essential tool for connecting, right? But what if we could also use that media to express the feelings and the challenges of living translocally? So this is what we did with this project. You saw Negar, the first woman who talked. She's deeply connected with, for example, talking about refugee challenges or the challenges of being a refugee in the Netherlands. So you can imagine that having the skills to actually speak up and, let's say, share these movies beyond her community is actually, it's something that is actually quite valuable for them. So this is a community that is often marginalized from media making itself. So for them to build their own discourses is relevant. But also on the challenge side, which is again something that I'm sure we find ourselves struggling with, is the power relations that sometimes are we have to navigate when we go and research or when we try to build translocal networks. Because you saw, for example, the second woman, Emine from Turkey, she's talking about a loss of identity, a loss of place, and usually this community comes with the vulnerable label, right? That hinders a lot their agency and their autonomy in processes like this. So it's not about us researchers saying, I'm going to show you how to, how to live translocally better or how to build your networks better, but it's actually listening to them. And I think we were talking about it before, listening to what they need and shaking a little bit this label of vulnerability that won't let them share in this case, or let them decide how and when to share their translocal lives or their narratives. So I will leave it at that, because I think that's over 5 minutes, but looking forward to your questions as well.
Thank you very much, Camilla. That looks like an amazing project. I guess we're all curious and eager to watch those documentaries now. So thanks a lot for sharing. So we have come to the last part of the chat storm. So just to remind everyone, I'm gonna go back to the last person who asked a question and invite that person to nominate the first one. In the meantime, please keep your questions coming. I'm gonna ask my colleagues to spotlight all the panelists. So remember, you can ask questions to all of them right now, all 5 of them. We have about 25 minutes, so I hope that we have at least 2 rounds and maybe even 3 rounds. Let's see how it goes. So please put your questions in the chat.
How radical can you show your group or network to be? If you appear too anti-capitalist, can this scare off some people?
I'm happy to. Actually, that was going to be my question as well to the other speakers, because it's something I face quite a lot in my work. And Sol, for example, you mentioned new municipalism. I think personally, I'm all for approaches like that. But when I put my policy hat on, and if I were to suggest something like this to European policymakers or even MEPs, it would really, I think I would have very different reactions depending upon their, political leanings. So that's something I struggle with myself, as in, where does the line, where do you actually draw the line, and how can you find ways for your points to sort of resonate with everyone? But one lesson that I have learned though is that it's about framing. For example, when we're talking to groups that may well lean on the right, we would talk about, say, stewardship. But then if we're talking to, say, for example, the Greens, then we'd say ownership of, of the transition. So it's just, I think one thing I've learned is framing really, really matters. And sometimes you just, you try and find a way to sort of put across your point in a way that it can resonate with the broadest possible range of decision makers and policymakers. I guess that would be my 2 cents.
Thank you. So I think Sol now has 2 questions. Run from the crowd and from the co-panelists. Over to you, Sol.
Yeah, well, Yeah, I think, Namita, you already answered. It really depends on your audience. What is your frame? So indeed, the way you're going to talk to MEP, it really is different to a meeting with activists in a basement. This doesn't mean that you are going to change your goals or what are your structural proposals, right? Actually, the way I started to talk so explicitly about post-capitalism is quite recent, and it partially explained of indeed the fear of being put in this kind of little box where if you talk about capitalism, you are automatically a communist, statist, Stalinist. So for me, if we are talking about, if we are critical about capitalism as a political and economic system, I think what is useful is to understand why. No. So what I really try to avoid is to use words like capitalism or neoliberalism without explaining what actually I mean with that. And really, one of the things that really has made me be more explicit is really the latest big demonstrations for climate justice. And I really see the younger generations really having a very strong anti-capitalist discourse, also anti-racist, actually. And but what does it mean? Because if this sentiment that the system is not working for them and for the planet, well, those who have had the privilege to have access to information, to networks, to money, we have to actually explain what does it mean, because otherwise others will explain what does it mean. And usually the media controlled by right-wing groups or the big corporations, they would just say, yeah, but there is no alternative really. So if you want to go to an anti-capitalist group, you want to go to live in Cuba or China or North Korea. And we have to be able to make that battle, because otherwise the argument ends there, no? So I think it's framing, and in this framing, what do we actually mean with capitalism and neoliberalism?
How critical do you think organized labor is to transformative cities or Cooperation Jackson's efforts? Are they a benefit or sometimes an impediment, and what would be helpful to you?
And on the question on organized labor, just to say that for the Transformative Cities Initiative, we have been very open on who can actually participate in the awards. So we are very open, and we have had participants from very grassroots groups, but also from city councils for public utilities like the water public utility in Paris, also finalists of transformative cities, but also initiatives who are really run by trade unions. Because of course, organized labor has many different faces in many different parts of the world. And yeah, I would just say one case in India who won in the first case, the semi-skilled women who were not semi-skilled, very skilled, but not in the formal work market. They were doing the cigarettes with their hands. That was their job. And thanks to working with a trade union, they self-organized themselves to become the biggest housing cooperative in Asia. So I would just say organized labor is a very important actor, like many others, and it depends on the context. So yeah, definitely it's worth to work with them.
Thank you, Sol. So, Brian, are you ready to nominate the next question? And people, keep your questions coming.
Could you elaborate on the concept of cosmopolitan justice? Is it related to the assumption that all humans share some notions of the concept of justice?
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to start off by saying it's not a concept. I wish I could take credit for this concept, but it isn't something that isn't a conceptual sort of framework I came up with. So cosmopolitanism goes as far back as Kant, and it can be found in John Rawls' sort of writing. But more recently, I think it is essentially this idea that all human beings, regardless of their ethnicity, gender, class, should be treated as equal. And when you consider, so it's this idea of how it basically holds this notion that we should treat others the way that we ourselves wish to be treated. And this idea of, so basically it becomes the foundation of global climate justice. If you think about it, if you sort of think of it as a notion of justice that where everyone in the world has the same kind of rights and access and privileges as you do. So that's where sort of cosmopolitanism comes in, and that's how it ties into this idea of global climate justice. Does that help?
Do we need better, more open source media platforms to go against the mainstream media and have more marginalized voices come through?
So on one hand, yes, I think we need more platforms to, let's say, share different discourses around, in this case, the topic of living translocally as a refugee. But then on the other hand, I also think that this against mainstream media immediately puts these discourses as the small, vulnerable again, right, kind of stories. And what I actually think we need is, I don't know if you heard about the concept citizens media, which is kind of steps out of this debate and it starts questioning what can citizens offer in the, let's say, in the media, and how can communities like them can access different tools to develop their own media, which in many ways they are already doing. And if you see what social media it's allowing is exactly that they bring about their own discourses, but not only from the perspective, I think, of crafting this narrative, but also maybe we need better platforms for them to decide where do they want to put these discourses, because many of the participants in this project, for example, they face issues of surveillance, for example, from their own government. So this is something that shapes a lot how you live, how you come to live in a new host society, how you come to contact, others in your host society, if you know you're being watched, or if you know, right? So rather than maybe only offering more tools to craft discourses, is also offering maybe more spaces for them to decide where do they want these discourses to go and to reach. Yeah, I think it's complicated anyways.
To what extent are translocal initiatives carried out by elite, privileged people with the tools to address the challenges? How do you transfer these tools and knowledges to the masses? And how do we build and transfer knowledge in partnership with the poor and marginalized people?
I saw this question earlier and provided some written piece to it. And I'll start by saying, a good chunk of our membership is homeless. Literacy, in terms of written literacy, is a major struggle for a good portion of our membership. I would say on average, most of the membership probably has like a 6th grade educational level, right, in terms of their reading comprehension. Now, does that mean that that is a barrier of anybody's intelligence? Absolutely not. In no fundamental way. It's just more of an expression of how the nature of structural racism and white supremacy is here in Mississippi, and the barriers that is posted to people's formal education. But being someone who's lived in many places throughout the United States, I would actually say that Mississippi and the base that we have is one of the more educated bases in population centers I've ever encountered here in the United States. One, we don't have to, just given the nature of the social conditions, we don't have to convince hardly anybody that they are oppressed or facing exploitation. Sometimes just that fact alone can be a major barrier to organizing and conscious formation here within the United States. The challenges we have here is not so much convincing people that something is like wrong. It's convincing folks that we can do something about it, right? And that their actions will actually translate into an improvement in their lives. That is the greatest skepticism that people have to me, it matches the piece that it kind of dovetails this part of the question about how radical you can be. And the thing that we've always emphasized, there's always code switching, there's always context, and let's not act like it doesn't exist. But just given who we are in our political history, our project and the family I come from a very radical history of folks who've been killed. Folks, I have many relatives who live in exile now, who've been in prison for decades. And this is not something we can, or I could hide from the community in any form or fashion. Anybody with Google could look up some of these things now and find some of this information if they so choose. So our thing is, we want to be honest with the people about what we believe, what we're fighting for, and not shy away from all the challenges of kind of the socialist experiments, which we kind of get labeled into. And so we don't shy away from that. We say, yeah, there were many mistakes, but let's look at the project that you're embedded in. I think genocide and slavery were critical mistakes, but you're here, you're still dealing with this. And if you want something better, we have to work and make it better. These are all systems that humans have constructed, and we can deconstruct them, and we can make something new if we so choose. It won't be easy, it'll be challenging, but that's the orientation that we have. But this is not just for elites. It does depend on how much respect we have for people and their capacity, right, and for their intelligence, whether they can read the academic text or the Marxist text or whatever the hell we put in front of people. Like, I learned that if I, just like you can learn it. There is no barrier to there. It's just the interest of time, energy, and capacity. And that's the orientation I think that we put forward. We're trying to meet real practical things about, can we help you secure housing? Can we help build the housing? Can we provide the food? Like that, those things are what's winning folks over who are not like elites or come from extreme academic backgrounds in our community, which is not that in great abundance where I live anyway, right? So some things are also about where you place your project and how you integrate it in with different resources that are available. Like, we don't shun anybody away because they have a college degree, right? It's just making sure that your degree doesn't mean that you have more intelligence or more access to anything that we're doing than anybody else does.
Okay, thank you, Kali. Camilla has to leave, so I first give the word to her, and then to Sophia, and then Namita, and then we end with Sol, and then we have a look at the graphic harvest that Julia van Leeuwen made for us. Over to you, Camilla.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I do have to leave in a bit. But just to keep it short, I do think there are many initiatives that are carried out, mainly, let's say, by not so privileged groups. I just think that perhaps the platforms that they have to disseminate maybe are not the most accessible ones. And I think the right approach, once again, to perhaps build this knowledge transfer or maybe to have a co-production of knowledge is participatory. It's a participatory approach in which you don't bring your knowledge to a community, but you rather ask first if they need any help. And one point there, for example, what we did in this project that I share with you, with the participants, is that we co-design the whole program with them. So prior to the whole workshops, with them we work on, okay, what is important for you to learn, but also what motivates you to learn what we're going to learn, perhaps, because if they cannot find this motivation in themselves, then what we're doing is not, it won't lead to any sustainable, let's say, change. And one case example that we had in our workshop actually was a woman from Iran who, after engaging in the workshop, she started her YouTube channel, and she started sharing videos about her life for her family and for other friends who are struggling with things that she already overcame after many years navigating the system of being an immigrant or a refugee in the Netherlands. And for us, that is or we hope that that actually is some kind of knowledge transfer that maybe she can even teach or she can even share, further with her community. So I would leave it at that, and I'll say goodbye now because I do have to leave. But
thank you, Camilla. We will share the link to the documentaries and watch
thank
it.
you,
So
and
maybe
also
we'll
to
have
the drawing. I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah,
to
of
see
course.
it.
We'll share it all. Thank you. Ciao.
Okay.
Sophia, can I hand over to you?
Yes, so maybe briefly, I think that my response is no. Generally, this sort of networked innovation is not really just for elites, because innovation, I think, is born from challenges that are innovation directly responds to needs that are on the ground. I think there's a saying that necessity is the mother of creation or something like that. And within Urbana, some of the most innovative examples addressing sustainability and justice are really coming bottom up from communities in Brussels that are forming land trusts because they can't afford housing there, or from communities in Brixton, London, who are addressing energy poverty due to high prices there and poor energy standards in their outdated buildings. So, but I think where the challenge is coming up in this is when these conversations get too far removed from the local context, maybe and the local realities. And for me, this is when red flags start popping up, is when the conversations get too abstract, when they start to get way too academic. This is where we see more barriers and it gets more exclusive, and yes, I would say more elite. So just to always stay rooted while trying to continuously bring these themes and these important examples up to a translocal level, if you see it as up, maybe out.
Thanks, Sophia. The ever big challenge of wide versus deep that you mentioned earlier, or how to navigate that. Thank you. Namita.
Thanks, Flo. I think I'd just like to echo what Sophia said. I don't think that innovative initiatives necessarily are only carried out mainly by elites. I think, in fact, the most powerful ones are the ones that sort of trickle up, that are bottom up, and then that trickle up. But at the same time, I have to say, when it comes to policy making, yes, it is still very much sort of expertise dominated. But that's one of the reasons that why, as part of my job at E3G, one of the things that we're trying to push for is the recognition of lived experience as a form of expertise. So the EU, for example, is quite in favor of having expert bodies or platforms with experts. So we're also trying to push for citizens to be part of these expert bodies, but to not just throw them in the deep end, but to sort of support their participation with financial support, say honorarium, or even childcare, transport costs, transportation costs, just so that their participation can actually be facilitated and enabled, because that's important as well if the process is to be truly participatory. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Namita. Last word for the panelists to Sol.
Thank you. And thanks for putting forward the question about privilege, which is crucial. And indeed, you can see many spaces that are translocal. There is some level of privilege. Some have been mentioned already before, on language expertise or access to the internet, which is a clear boundary in many regions in the world. So I think, yeah, it's healthy to recognize that and to understand that we are all privileged in different ways, and to learn from the intersectionality frame to understand what's our position in society. And I'm obviously very privileged in many different ways, but my take is trying to understand how can I better use my position of privilege, so not only to and try to undermine my own privilege, but also acknowledging I do have them. So how can I better use it for those who are less privileged? And I'm a feminist, and what I'm trying to do is to bring feminist critique to male-dominated spaces. Is the little thing I could try to do. But yeah, I think it's very healthy to keep reminding us of that privilege question. And let me just share on how to bring knowledge to more people. We are just now launching the first online course in collaboration with the Open University of Recoleta in Chile. They are very excited about the Chilean government, but they are working for a long time. It's a very grassroots initiative in the municipality of Recoleta, and we are working with them to explore how local transformations happen. So I'm going to share the link in the chat. It's a whole diploma, has become with 4 online courses, and it's free of charge as long as you have internet, which again is a privilege also to places. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sol. Thank you, Sol. So I also invite everyone to continue sharing links, questions, comments in the chat. We're gonna finalize now. We're reaching the end of this event, but we're gonna keep the event, the Zoom open for 5 minutes with some music, not to be talking, but rather to invite everyone to add more links or to read back into everything that was shared before. Just to round off, thanks a lot for being here. It was a pleasure to see you all and to hear these interesting panelists share their experiences, their delights and struggles. Maybe we should think also more of them as paradoxes. As soon as you empower people, there's always the risk of creating new elites. As soon as you organize at the European level, trying to be translocal about it, you create a new risk of being exclusive to the rest of the world. As soon as you start to create at a translocal level, you get to this meta network level and you lose the risk of losing the connection to locality. So these are really kind of paradoxes that, like, as we say in Dutch, they cut and both a knife that cuts both ways. And the real challenge is to stay critical, radical, political, and really question ourselves and use whatever privilege comes to challenge the privilege. So to end with that very speedy summary, we will, of course, follow up. So if you are hungry for more, there is a very interesting event tomorrow on the art of just city making. So if you want more, there is something tomorrow. My colleagues will share the link in the chat. There will also be a next event that we are co-organizing with Drift on food justice on the 12th of May. There's no link yet, but we will share that with you guys in the follow-up email. So there will be a follow-up email with collecting all the information that was shared today. And of course, the visual harvest, for which we're going to have a sneak preview. And one more thing, we're going to ask all of you if you could please fill in the feedback form on any ideas, feedback, insights, critiques on this event, how to do it next time. We would love to hear from you. So my colleagues are going to share that link. But now to introduce the real ending, I would like to ask Julia to share the sneak preview of the visual harvest, and then we can admire it more in detail later on. Julia.
Yes, I'm going to share my screen so you can see the drawing. So there it is. Oh, I see that you're still in a little menu on the side. I'll put you
No,
over
it's
here.
good. We're seeing it good.
Okay.
We're seeing it well, yeah. Lovely.
So it's not finished yet, but it's the beginning. So I put in a lot of elements that I heard. I really love the one from Sol, from the big sky with all the stars, and which one is which ones are formative. I really love the metaphor. Also, I put in a lot of bees because I thought of beehives because they all have like one goal, but they all work separately. So it was my metaphor for translocal connections. I made little portraits of all the speakers, as you can see. There's going to be a lot of things filled in the black and white sketches, as you can see.
Wow, that looks amazing.
There's a lot to see. So you have to check it out afterwards when it's finished. And
Thank you.
Super look nice. At the details.
Thank you, Julia. I can't wait to share the final result. Thanks a lot. And thanks to all the participants. So enjoy the music, share whatever you want to share, fill in the feedback form with the music, without the music, and see you next time. Ciao.